1861. For the new Seventh-day Adventists, this will be a year of continuing organization and special revelation. As for the nation, the conflagration of secession is about to erupt into war, and the United States will soon be engulfed in turmoil and heartbreak. On January 12, James and Ellen White, J.N. Loughborough, and other leaders of the Adventist Church gather to dedicate the new church in Parkville, Michigan. During the event, something out of the ordinary occurs. John Loughborough records,
"A large congregation assembled. Brother Waggoner gave the sermon, and Brother White gave the dedicatory prayer. Sister White followed with a very powerful exhortation. Then, as she sat down in the chair, she was taken off in vision, which lasted some 20 minutes or more. After coming out of the vision, she again addressed the people, relating what had just been shown to her." John Loughborough.
Ellen White has her first Civil War vision in the Parkville, Michigan church, and that comes as a shock to those Adventists who are listening.
And she said, "A terrible war is coming on this land." She just said, "I heard the booming of the cannons. I saw the dead and dying all around."
I think that many, particularly in the North, thought that the Southerners wouldn't actually engage in insurrection, and that indeed if they did, it would be over quickly.
And then at the end she said, "There are those here who will lose sons in that war."
And that was astounding to her hearers at that time. They not only didn't anticipate a war, they certainly could not imagine that their own sons would be lost in such a conflict.
While the message is shocking to the congregation, a vision from Ellen White is not a new event. Since 1844, she has been delivering what the Adventists believe to be prophetic testimony from God.
Ellen White was a woman whom Adventists believed received messages from God for the comfort and instruction of the Adventists, the early Adventist believers. And as they tested her by the biblical principles, they determined that they believed that she was receiving messages from God, not to take the place of the Bible, but to help God's people understand the Bible better.
And so, even as it's not yet happening, she's saying words that are preparing Adventists and giving them some context to the Civil War.
Now, what I find interesting is that Ellen White had no desire and never even remotely attempted to bring her prediction to the larger audience in America. She understood clearly she was not a prophet to the nation. This was just for God's people, for the Adventist audience. And that's where she kept her focus. But it brought them great encouragement.
The prospects of peace are dashed shortly after the Parkville vision. Only 4 days later, January 16, an important compromise proposal for peace brought to Congress by Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden is defeated in the United States Senate. Throughout the month, more states secede from the Union: Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. At the end of January, Kansas is admitted to the Union as a free state. In February, even before Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated, Jefferson Davis is elected as the provisional president of the Confederate States, and Texas also secedes from the Union. On March 4, Abraham Lincoln is finally inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States of America.
One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one, to preserve, protect, and defend it. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
Notwithstanding Lincoln's hopeful words, the national situation continues to deteriorate. At Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson and 127 loyal Union troops are surrounded by rebel batteries. The fort is the last Union outpost in South Carolina and is quickly taking on a symbolic significance for the entire country.
And so Sumter became, the rallying cry, because it was an occupied federal fort, paid for with federal money, not South Carolina. That was not a South Carolina fort, it was a federal fort.
Should Lincoln withdraw his troops? Should he order reinforcements and start a bloody contest? Conflicting advice comes from every side.
Lincoln knew they had to fire first. He could not be seen firing first. He was going to make them shoot him. They were going to have to do it. That makes them the aggressor nation. And that had to be the case. He could not be seen as the aggressor.
Confederate batteries open fire on Fort Sumter on April 12. War has begun. On the heels of Fort Sumter, the last Confederate states leave the Union. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. On May 20, Richmond, Virginia, is named the new Confederate capital. Even as states are seceding, the Advent Review Publishing Association, which had been named the previous year, is finally incorporated under Michigan law. Now discussion turns to the structure of the church itself.
Brother Loughborough presents as the next subject for consideration a more complete organization of the church. Moved by Brother Hull that the ministers assembled at this conference be requested to write out an address on the subject of church organization. Carried.
The ministers write the requested document, and it appears in the Review and Herald on June 11. For the next several months, debate rages over the proposed plans, including the organization of standing state and district conferences. Adventists back east vehemently oppose the idea, and the spectre of Cottrell's words published a year ago come back to haunt, that organizing lies at the foundation of Babylon. They even go so far as to suggest that the Battle Creek Adventists have apostatized and become Babylon already. James White is especially discouraged by this resistance. Returning from a tour of the East, he writes,
On our Eastern tour thus far, we seem to be wading through the influence of a stupid uncertainty upon the subject of organization. The infection was deep and stupefying. Many of our brethren, especially in the East, stood in doubt. The brethren in Pennsylvania voted down organization, and the cause in Ohio has been dreadfully shaken. It has suffered everywhere. A dreadful feeling of discouragement came over us that we have not yet been able to shake off. James White.
But before the issue can be settled, the Civil War begins in earnest. After nearly 4 months of military preparation, the armies of both the North and the South take to the field. On July 21, the first major battle of the American Civil War begins near the town of Manassas, Virginia, at a little creek called Bull Run. The Lincoln administration in Washington has been feeling intense pressure from the public to make a military showing. Everyone in the North believes the Union Army will push forward very quickly and make an end of the Confederacy's hopes and dreams.
The first major military action of the war is going to be the First Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, which is just outside of Washington, D.C.
That's where you have the first bloody clash and massive loss of life. And that changed everyone's attitude. I mean, it was quite a battle. And it basically was a loss for the North. They thought they were going to come in and just wipe the South out, and it would be an easy victory, and the war would be over. Well, the Battle of Manassas changed everything.
The sense in Washington, and the sense amongst some military advisors, is that this is going to be a cakewalk. We have trained troops supplemented with lots of volunteers who are going to just come down and overwhelm the Confederates. And as a matter of fact, it's viewed very much as a sort of a holiday, has almost a holiday atmosphere to it as people come out of Washington to watch.
You've got green troops, none of them are very good. By simply raw luck and Stonewall Jackson's cussed determination, they were able to hold their own, and the Union panicked first and broke them. This is not a sterling battle. This is not a wonderful example on either side, really, but it shows that this would be a clumsy, brutal affair.
I mean, all the stories and all the narratives about Manassas talk about this massive retreat where the troops just at one point became confused and they all retreated, and literally they ran all the way back to Washington. And it became mass confusion because all the civilians that were several miles down the road watching the battle saw the Northern troops running back. They panicked. They all got on the same road. You have civilians and panicked troops together. Many people lost their lives, were hurt.
When the Union Army now has to pull back, there's this sort of mass calamity as all those people who came out expecting sort of a Sunday picnic are now scrambling in panic to try to get back to Washington, D.C. And it doesn't matter, I think, whether you're wearing civilian dress or soldier dress. The minute you see people fleeing in panic, you want to flee in panic as well. And it just turns, what was supposed to be a very easy battle turns into an almost rout as the Union Army makes haste and runs pell-mell back to Washington, D.C.
Only 2 weeks later, as confusing news of the battle is still being relayed to the home front, the Seventh-day Adventists receive special insight. On August 3, Ellen White has another vision, which she says comes directly from God. She is shown by an angel the scenes of the battle which had taken place only 2 weeks before.
I had a view of the disastrous battle at Manassas, Virginia. The Northern army was moving on, not doubting but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. They rushed into battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then, an angel descended and waved his hand backward. Instantly there was confusion in the ranks, and a precipitate retreat commenced. Then it was explained that God had this nation in his own hand, and would not suffer victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and would permit no more losses to the Northern men than in his wisdom he saw fit, to punish them for their sins. And had the Northern army at this time pushed the battle still further, in their fainting, exhausted condition, the far greater struggle and destruction which awaited them would have caused great triumph in the South. God would not permit this, and sent an angel to interfere. The sudden falling back of the Northern troops is a mystery to all. They know not that God's hand was in the matter. Ellen White.
And so there was just massive chaos. So she is describing something that is documented in the literature about this particular battle. But what's most significant is the interpretation she gives to this battle, the theological interpretation.
Ellen White, in her prophetic vision dealing with First Bull Run, sees the religious aspect or the religious side of that. There is definitely a religious tone amongst evangelicals in general to the war itself. Lots of them will see the war as punishment to the United States for even tolerating the institution of slavery, and certainly for tolerating it for as long as they did. And Ellen White certainly fits into that category.
There were newspapers, of course, at that time, and they were hearing about these terrible battles, the tremendous loss of life, to know that God was giving messages to Ellen White that related to the very times in which they lived and the horrific news that they were hearing, must have been comforting to know that God in His sovereignty was revealing at least parts of His will to His people.
It gave them a sense of hope that they would get through this experience. Therefore, they didn't have to be obsessed with what's going to happen with the next battle. They could leave it in the Lord's hands. This nation was in His hands. The North would eventually prevail. Slavery would not prevail in this nation. God would take care of that so they could focus on other things. And I would suggest that that was a part of the motivation to organize. So they had hope that they could organize and that it would serve a purpose to reach out to the world. That, in other words, things were going to go beyond the Civil War.
As the war dominates the national landscape, the Adventists struggle with organization. Debate continues in congregations across the country and in the pages of the Review. But finally, at a general meeting held October 5 and 6 in Battle Creek, the very first Seventh-day Adventist Conference is formed. The leaders and members in the state come together and agree that they will form a standing body that will provide leadership, guidance, and organization to the Adventist churches in Michigan.
Resolved that we recommend to the churches in the state of Michigan to unite in one conference with the name of the Michigan Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Adopted.
James White sums up the hopeful feelings of the Battle Creek leadership as he says,
"We are glad to see our people awake to the subject of organization. To us, it is a sign of better days."
But sadly, better days are not ahead for the nation.